In the smoky glow of mid-century Las Vegas, when neon lights hummed like living things and the night never truly slept, Dean Martin stood at a strange crossroads in his life, one that had nothing to do with music, fame, or applause. From the outside, Dean looked untouchable, a man whose laughter seemed effortless. His charm floated across rooms like perfume, whose voice could turn clinking glasses into silence. Yet behind the tailored suits and the easy grin lived a man who had learned, through hard years and harder choices, that success often comes with shadows attached. Shadows that watch quietly and wait for the right moment to step forward. That moment arrived not on a stage, not beneath spotlights, but in a quiet back room of a hotel that pretended to be ordinary. The carpet was thick enough to swallow footsteps, the walls dressed in muted colors that suggested privacy rather than comfort. Dean had been invited under the pretense of a casual conversation. Nothing formal, nothing threatening, just to talk. In the world Dean navigated, such invitations carried meaning without explanation. He understood that silence could be louder than words, and tonight, silence had been carefully arranged as he took his seat. Dean felt the familiar instinct to read the room, a habit sharpened long before fame found him. He noticed the careful distance between chairs, the way the men across from him avoided sudden movements, how their politeness felt rehearsed. These were not men interested in admiration or applause. They were interested in outcomes. One of them spoke first, his voice smooth, respectful, almost friendly, as if addressing a colleague rather than a man whose name echoed across radio waves and marquees. They spoke of loyalty, of old connections, of favors that had been given long ago and never forgotten. The words were chosen carefully, never crossing into threats, never touching illegality outright. Instead, they circled the subject like dancers who knew every step by heart. Dean listened, nodding occasionally, his expression calm, his posture relaxed, though his mind was fully awake. Experience had taught him that the most dangerous conversations are the ones that pretend to be reasonable. Then the offer came, placed gently on the table like a gift wrapped in courtesy. It was not described as payment, not as a bribe, and certainly not as something ugly. It was framed as protection, as appreciation, as a way to ensure that certain stories never traveled beyond the rooms where they were born. Dean understood immediately what was being asked of him. Silence, dressed up as cooperation. Compliance, disguised as mutual respect. The sum attached to that silence was large enough to change lives, large enough to erase worries, large enough to tempt even the most grounded man to rationalize acceptance. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room waited, not impatiently, but with the confidence of men who believed they understood how the world worked. Dean leaned back slightly, his fingers resting loosely against the arm of the chair, his face unreadable. Inside him, memories stirred, not of wealth or fame, but of lean years when dignity was the only possession he could truly claim. He thought of the long road that had brought him here, of the values quietly instilled long before anyone cared to listen to him sing, values that had survived failure, reinvention, and success. Dean knew that the choice in front of him had little to do with money. Money, he had learned, is rarely the true issue. The real cost was something else entirely. It was the slow erosion of self, the moment you agreed to be owned even slightly. The first step toward becoming someone who trades truth for comfort. He also knew that once silence is sold, it can never truly be bought back. Today it might be one favor, tomorrow another, until the line between who you are and what you're expected to be dissolves entirely. When Dean finally spoke, his voice was gentle, almost warm, carrying none of the defiance the men across from him might have expected. He thanked them for their respect, for the way they had approached him, for the courtesy of the conversation. He acknowledged the generosity of the offer without exaggeration or mockery. And then, with a calm that seemed to surprise even himself, he explained that there were some things he could not accept, not because he feared consequences, but because he valued something far more fragile than security. The ability to look at himself without flinching. The room shifted subtly. Chairs creaked. Eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in reassessment. Dean did not raise his voice, did not make speeches, did not frame himself as a hero. He spoke plainly, explaining that his life, his work, and his name meant nothing if they required him to carry a weight he never asked for. He made it clear that he harbored no ill will, no judgment, only a firm boundary he would not step across. What followed was not the explosion many would imagine, not anger or threats or raised voices. Instead, there was a long pause, the kind that reveals more than confrontation ever could. The men exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them. They had expected resistance, perhaps bargaining, perhaps fear. What they encountered instead was something harder to move. A man who had already decided who he was. Long before they walked into the room, when they finally stood to leave, their demeanor remained polite, almost respectful. The offer was quietly withdrawn, the conversation closed as neatly as it had begun. Dean watched them go, his heart steady, his expression unchanged. Only after the door closed did he allow himself a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Later that night, as Dean returned to the public world of lights and music, no one in the audience knew what had happened behind closed doors. They saw only the familiar smile, heard only the voice that felt like home. But something invisible had shifted. Not in the city, not in the industry, but within the quiet space where character is tested and defined. Dean sang, as he always did. But beneath every note lived the certainty that integrity once chosen becomes a kind of armor. And while money can open many doors, it cannot buy the peace that comes from knowing you did not sell yourself when it mattered most. The days that followed that quiet meeting did not announce themselves with drama. Yet Dean Martin felt their weight settle over his life like an unseen change in the weather, subtle but undeniable. From the outside, nothing appeared different. The marquee still carried his name in glowing letters. The audiences still laughed at his timing and leaned into his voice as if it were a familiar embrace. But beneath the surface of routine applause and practiced ease, Dean sensed that the decision he had made had not ended anything. It had merely shifted the game into a quieter, more psychological register, one where patience replaced pressure and observation replaced confrontation. He noticed it first in the smallest details, the kind most people would dismiss as coincidence. A familiar producer who had once returned his calls within minutes now took days. His tone polite but distant, as though an invisible protocol had suddenly been introduced. A long-standing engagement was rescheduled without explanation, then rescheduled again until the reason no longer mattered as much as the pattern. Dean did not confront anyone, did not ask questions that would invite answers he did not need. He understood that power often expresses itself not through force, but through absence. Through doors that stop opening without ever being slammed at night. When the noise faded and the city slipped into its artificial sleep, Dean found himself thinking not about fear, but about resolve. He had grown up knowing what uncertainty felt like, had lived through periods when tomorrow was a question mark and dignity was the only stable ground beneath his feet. Those memories returned now, not as bitterness, but as reassurance. They reminded him that comfort is pleasant, but it is not essential, and that a man who has already survived without privilege cannot be undone by its withdrawal. Still, the silence pressed in its own way. Friends who cared for him noticed a shift, a thoughtful pause before his laughter, a deeper stillness behind his eyes. They asked if he was tired, if the pace was finally catching up to him, and Dean smiled it away, unwilling to burden anyone with a conflict they could not solve. He knew that true tests of character are often lonely, not because no one loves you, but because the choice itself belongs to you alone. The next contact did not come directly. It arrived instead through suggestion, through conversations that sounded harmless, but carried an undertone of orchestration. A mutual acquaintance casually mentioned how unpredictable the industry could be, how quickly favor could turn into friction, how some men learned too late that cooperation was easier than principle. The words were not aimed like arrows. They drifted instead like smoke, meant to linger, to be inhaled without resistance. Dean listened politely, responded with humor, and let the conversation end without offering anything it could carry back as leverage. What unsettled him most was not the implication of consequences, but the assumption beneath it. The belief that everyone, given enough time, can be negotiated down to their weakest point. Dean rejected that assumption, not with anger, but with quiet certainty. He believed that a man's worth is not measured by how much pressure he can endure before breaking, but by how little explanation he needs to stand firm. To him, integrity was not something you defend loudly. It was something you practice consistently, even when no one is watching and no reward is guaranteed. As weeks passed, the pressure remained indirect, yet persistent. Invitations that once arrived automatically now required negotiation. Rumors surfaced, never damaging enough to confront, but inconvenient enough to create friction. Dean recognized the strategy immediately. It was not about punishment. It was about fatigue. The hope was that, over time, he would grow tired of resistance. That practicality would replace conviction. That he would reconsider not because he believed he was wrong, but because standing alone is exhausting, yet something unexpected happened in that stretch of quiet resistance. Dean began to feel lighter. The absence of compromise created a clarity he had not known he was missing. Decisions became simpler when he removed the option of self-betrayal from consideration. He no longer had to calculate which words might please unseen listeners or which silences might be misinterpreted. He spoke when he meant to speak, declined when he meant to decline, and trusted that whatever followed would be manageable precisely because it would be honest. One evening, after a performance that drew a particularly long-standing ovation, Dean lingered on stage for a moment longer than usual. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, strangers bound together by a shared experience, by music that asked nothing of them except attention. It struck him then that this was the only contract he had ever truly signed. It's an unspoken agreement to offer something genuine in exchange for trust. That realization grounded him more firmly than any assurance of protection ever could. Behind the scenes, tone shifted again. The quiet resistance he had maintained began to register not as defiance, but as permanence. Those who observed him realized that time was not eroding his stance, that inconvenience was not softening his resolve. In worlds built on leverage, certainty is often respected more than compliance. And Dean's refusal to explain himself further sent a message no speech could deliver. He was not waiting to be persuaded. He was not asking for permission. He was simply continuing by the end of that season. It became clear that the pressure had reached its limit without achieving its aim. The conversation slowed, then stopped. The hints evaporated. What remained was an unspoken understanding that some men are not moved by offers, nor by absence, nor by discomfort, because their center of gravity lies somewhere deeper than fear or ambition. Dean returned fully to his work, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it no longer mattered, and in that quiet victory, unseen by headlines and unrecorded by history, Dean learned something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. When you refuse to sell your silence, you gain something far more valuable than protection. You gain the freedom to live without rehearsing excuses, to walk into any room without calculating your debt, and to stand still while others circle, waiting for you to move. By the time the third phase of the story unfolded, Dean Martin no longer felt as though he was being tested, yet he sensed that he was being measured. There is a difference between pressure meant to bend you and observation meant to understand you. And Dean could feel that shift clearly now. The silence that once carried tension had transformed into a kind of watchfulness, as if unseen eyes were no longer asking how far he could be pushed, but how firmly he would remain exactly where he stood. For a man who had built his life on instinct, this change was unmistakable. And it confirmed something he had quietly believed all along. Endurance without explanation eventually speaks louder than resistance ever could. The industry around him began to adjust in subtle but meaningful ways. Invitations returned, not dramatically, but steadily, as though the system itself had recalibrated to include him again without conditions. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments of what had occurred, only a gradual restoration of normalcy that felt earned rather than granted. Dean accepted this shift without commentary. He understood that power rarely admits miscalculation, but it often adapts to reality once denial becomes inefficient. His refusal to dramatize the moment preserved his dignity and reinforced the message. He'd already delivered simply by staying consistent. What surprised him most was not the easing of pressure, but the quiet respect that followed. Men who had once spoken around him now spoke directly, choosing clarity over suggestion. Conversations grew more honest, less layered with implication, as though a silent agreement had been reached that ambiguity would no longer be effective with him. Dean noticed that people listened differently now. It's not because he was louder or more forceful, but because his words carried the weight of someone who could not be cornered into contradiction. He had become, in a sense, predictable in the most unsettling way possible. His values did not shift with circumstance, away from the public eye. Dean reflected on how easily the situation could have unfolded differently. He recognized that fear often disguises itself as practicality, whispering that compromise is maturity and that standing firm is naivete. He also understood now that those whispers lose their power when a man decides in advance which parts of himself are non-negotiable. The clarity of that decision had not made his life easier in the short term, but it had simplified it profoundly, stripping away internal debate and replacing it with quiet resolve. One evening, during a private gathering far removed from cameras and crowds, Dean found himself seated across from a man whose presence carried history and influence without requiring introduction. The conversation unfolded naturally, touching on music, legacy, and the strange cost of longevity in a world that consumes talent quickly and forgets even faster. At one point, the man paused, studying Dean with an expression that suggested something unspoken had finally found its moment. He remarked almost casually that not many people know how to say no and mean it, and fewer still understand that doing so sometimes earns more respect than agreement ever could. Dean did not respond immediately. He had learned that acknowledgement does not always require affirmation. Instead, he nodded gently, accepting the observation without pride or defensiveness. In that moment, he realized that the choice he had made weeks earlier had traveled farther than he could have anticipated, reshaping perceptions in rooms he had never entered and influencing outcomes he would never witness directly. Integrity, he understood, does not announce itself. It moves quietly through systems built on leverage, unsettling assumptions simply by existing as time passed. The story that never made headlines began to influence Dean in unexpected ways. He felt a renewed sense of ownership over his work, a deeper connection to the performances that defined him. Singing no longer felt like maintenance of a reputation, but a reaffirmation of purpose. Each note carried the unspoken knowledge that he had preserved something essential, not just for himself, but as an example to others navigating similar crossroads without guidance or reassurance. Younger artists, drawn to his presence without fully understanding why, sought his counsel more frequently. They asked about success, about survival, about how to endure an industry that promised everything and demanded more in return. Dean never lectured. He spoke instead about knowing who you are before the world tries to tell you, about choosing a line you will not cross long before temptation arrives. He framed courage not as confrontation, but as consistency, the quiet refusal to trade tomorrow's peace for today's comfort. What Dean came to understand most clearly during this period was that power, when it encounters immovable conviction, often chooses withdrawal over collision. The myth that strength must always dominate began to dissolve in his mind, replaced by a more nuanced truth. Sometimes the strongest move is to remain unchanged, to let time and observation do the work that force never could. By refusing to react, to negotiate, or to dramatize, it allowed the situation to resolve itself without surrender. As the season drew to a close, Dean felt something rare settle into his life: alignment. His public persona, private values, and daily actions no longer felt like separate roles requiring careful balance. They had converged into a single, steady presence that no longer depended on approval or protection. He walked through his days with the calm certainty of someone who knows that whatever comes next will be faced without regret, because the hardest decision had already been made and honored. And though no one would ever publicly credit him for this quiet stand, Dean understood that some victories are not meant to be seen. They exist instead as internal landmarks, reminders that when tested, you did not flinch. In a world built on negotiation and influence, He had proven something far rarer than dominance. He had proven that character, once solidified, becomes untouchable. By the time the final chapter of this quiet confrontation unfolded, Dean Martin had reached a place few people ever truly arrive at, a place where the noise of external validation fades and the internal compass becomes the only authority worth consulting. The months that followed the unspoken resolution of pressure did not feel triumphant in any cinematic sense, yet they carried a depth of peace Dean had never known before. He moved through his days without the faint tension that once accompanied every decision, without the need to wonder whether his words or actions would echo back with unseen consequences. The absence of that weight revealed something remarkable. When a man refuses to sell his silence, he buys himself clarity, and clarity changes the way the world responds. Dean noticed that the city, which once felt like a maze of invisible expectations, now felt oddly transparent. Conversations unfolded with fewer layers, and intentions were easier to read, not because others had changed, but because he no longer needed to guess what they wanted from him. He had become immune to implication. Offers, when they came, were honest, or they did not come at all. The leverage that once hovered in the background had quietly dissolved, rendered useless by his refusal to participate in its logic. Those who observed him understood now that pressure had no place to land, because there was nothing he was afraid of losing that mattered more than his self-respect as his career continued. Dean's performances took on a new resonance, one audiences could feel even if they could not articulate it. His voice carried not just melody, but assurance, the sound of a man unburdened by compromise. Each appearance felt less like an obligation and more like a gift freely given. And that authenticity reached people in ways technical perfection never could. Fans sensed it, fellow performers recognized it, and even those who once viewed him as a negotiable asset now saw him as a fixed point, a presence that could not be quietly redirected or managed behind closed doors. There came a night, long after the tension had faded into memory, when Dean sat alone after a performance, the theater empty and echoing softly with the residue of applause. In that stillness, he reflected on how easily his life could have taken a different turn, how one moment of rationalization could have led to years of silent accommodation. He realized then that the most dangerous temptations rarely announce themselves as wrongdoing. They arrive instead as conveniences, as shortcuts framed as necessities, asking not for your soul all at once, but for small concessions that accumulate quietly until you no longer recognize yourself. Dean understood now why so many talented people lose their way without ever making a single dramatic mistake. It is not the fall that changes them, but the gradual bending, the slow agreement to live slightly misaligned with their own values. His refusal had not made him powerful in the conventional sense, but it had made him whole, and wholeness, he realized, is a form of strength that cannot be undermined by influence or wealth. In private moments, Dean began sharing this understanding with those who sought his perspective, not as advice delivered from above, but as experience offered without instruction. He spoke about drawing lines before they are tested, about choosing your non-negotiables early. When the cost of commitment feels abstract rather than urgent, he reminded them that the world often rewards compliance quickly and integrity slowly, but that only one of those rewards lasts when the noise fades. You are left alone with your reflection. What became clear over time was that the story of that offer, though never publicly told, had become part of Dean's legacy in a way no headline ever could. It lived in the respect he commanded without demanding it, in the freedom with which he moved through rooms once governed by tension, and in the quiet understanding shared by those who recognized what had transpired without needing it explained. The very people who had once believed silence could be purchased now treated him not as an obstacle or a liability, but as a boundary, something acknowledged rather than challenged. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no final declaration, no visible victory. The men who had once approached him simply adjusted their world to account for his immovability, and in doing so, they walked away not defeated, but informed. They learned that not every door opens with money, and not every man can be pressured into exchange. Dean had taught that lesson without raising his voice, without threatening exposure, without claiming moral superiority. He had taught it simply by being consistent. As the years moved forward, Dean carried this chapter with him quietly, not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder of who he chose to be when no one was watching. He understood that legacy is not built only on talent or success, but on the invisible decisions that shape how success is carried. When people spoke of him with admiration, it was not only for his voice or charm, but for the steadiness beneath them. The sense that here was a man who could be trusted not to disappear into convenience when tested, and that, ultimately, was the answer that made the world around him step back. Not defiance, not fearlessness, but the unshakable calm of someone who knows that integrity is not something you negotiate. It is something you live with, protect quietly, and pass on without spectacle. In choosing not to sell his silence, Dean Martin secured something no offer could ever match: a life lived without rehearsal, without regret, and without the need to explain himself to anyone.